bien si Gary est prêt pour débuter l'interprétariat. Si
Okay, so if our interpreters are ready and if all our participants are ready, I suggest now that we begin this third session of the international training course, which today is the second part on inventories and knowledge of heritage. For those who may have missed the session the day before yesterday, on Wednesday we saw inventories of heritage by a French region, the Occitania region, an operational inventory conducted by two municipalities in France and in North Macedonia, Cahors in France and Skopje in North Macedonia, who presented the work they had done on the inventory of their heritage. So we were looking more at questions of architectural heritage. Today we decided to extend our thoughts to other subjects. I know that among the different participants who are with us today from all over the world, there are specialists in architectural heritage, but also specialists more in archaeology, natural heritage, landscape heritage. So today we are proposing 4 presentations focused on archaeological heritage, on landscape heritage, and also on participatory grassroots inventory. And we'll also be proposing a presentation by Mohamed Ali Mwenje, who manages a UNESCO site, the old city of Lamu in Kenya. The French participants, we begin with Christelle Amand, who is in charge of cultural action at the archaeological unit of Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis just next to Paris. She'll be presenting that in a moment. Then we'll have a presentation by Claire Tartamella, heritage mediator at the tourist office in Pontivy, which is in Brittany, further off to the west in France. Then we will have Régine Chouvet, director of the Architecture, Urbanism and Environmental Council for the Atlantic Pyrenees, who will be presenting their inventory of landscapes. And then finally, as I said, Mr. Mwenje, who will be giving his presentation of the inventory conducted in the old town of Lamu. The timing allocated today has been prepared to present some concrete practical examples in France and abroad, but also to allow plenty of time for you to ask questions, to go into more detail on the presentations that have been given. So for each of the 4 speakers we will have today, we propose a maximum of 20 minutes for their presentation, followed by 15 minutes of discussion to go into the subject in more detail through your questions. For Christelle, who might not have known this before, here we have international project managers from all over the world. We have representatives from Central and Eastern Europe, from Romania, Poland, Hungary, North Macedonia, Albania, Czech Republic and Latvia, and also representatives of Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and China, I see also there with us, India, Lebanon as well, who are with us. So it's a very broad range of participants. So without further ado, Christelle, I suggest to hand over to you on this theme of how to make an archaeological dig visible and how to share it with the local people. And I'll just remind Christelle, that there is an interpreter who is translating at the same time into English, and that therefore, if you could just be careful not to speak too quickly or to avoid too many abbreviations. I know that we use a lot of very French abbreviations, but if you can avoid that. Can you see my screen or not? Yep, but very small for the moment. I think if you, we're getting there. In any case, I'm delighted to be here to speak to you today. I'm Christelle Amand. I work in the archaeology unit of the town of Saint-Denis to present our experiment in archaeology. So the idea, what I wanted to present to you here is I have a presentation in 3 parts. Present the area we are working in, I am working in with my department, and its particular features to be taken into account, to take a look at the regulatory framework for archaeology in France, which obviously has implications for the way we organize mediation activities, and then to take a practical example of an archaeological dig organized in Saint-Denis. So Saint-Denis, as was said, there is a municipality in the Paris region, just to the north of France, and we're part of an intermunicipal authority called Plaine Commune. It's the 3rd largest city in the Paris region by population, 112,000 people, a population which is constantly growing. It's a city with an industrial past, so a lot of former industrial land. The land isn't yet as expensive as in Paris as others, but that is attracting a lot of company headquarters and new populations. Because of its working class past, it's a city which is perhaps more modest, more fragile than many others in the country. We have a higher unemployment rate than in the rest of France, a larger proportion of households who are under the poverty line. It's also very multicultural. About 1/3 of our population is not of French nationality, 1/3. And it's a very young population. So these are all indicators which are very significant when we're organizing our mediation activities. It's also a territory with great archaeological potential, which is why we have a department dedicated to that today. Saint-Denis was where the first Christian in the Paris region was buried, who was called Denis, who gave his name to the town. He was arrested and condemned to death by the Romans and was buried in the place where you now have the Basilica of Saint-Denis. The presence of this important person, Saint Denis, gave rise to pilgrimages and the construction of an abbey which became very wealthy, which played an important political, economic, and spiritual role in medieval Europe. And it also had close relations with the royal authorities, and the basilica became the necropolis where the kings of France were generally buried from the year 1000 onwards. So this significant historic heritage justifies the fact that we have a municipal archaeology department, which is responsible for organizing archaeological digs, for making publications, for outreach to the public. We are a municipal service above all. You have an example there of family workshops with young children, showing how we wash archaeological artifacts, the management and conservation of archaeological finds, and managing and creating documentary evidence from the digs. So I also wanted to talk briefly about the regulatory framework in France. which also determines the promotion activities which are possible. There, on the one hand, there is scheduled, programmed archaeology and preventive archaeology. Programmed or scheduled archaeology is archaeology organized for scientific reasons. A research team from a university or a local authority or an association which applies to the state for the authorization to organize a dig in a site which it thinks is interesting to address a scientific subject. So generally, these authorizations are annual or 3 yearly. So we have the possibility to dig for several months a year over several years. So we have the time. This is supervised by the state. Archaeology is a discipline which obviously destroys the subject of its study. As you dig down and eliminate the layers, we're destroying archaeological evidence that we are studying. Preventive archaeology, in contrast, is mainly when there is a threat, because there is an urban development project, either private or public, which is likely to destroy traces of archaeological elements. So here the archaeologists don't choose where they are going to work. It's according to the development projects that come up, which means that we have a much more limited framework organized with the property developer. Preventive archaeology is demanded by the state. It's the state that, depending on when the building permit is issued by the city, decides whether there is an archaeological risk and whether preventive archaeology digs are necessary. So this has to be done quickly and well, and it is professional archaeologists who do this work. There is a list in France of archaeologists and archaeological departments who are authorized by the state to do this. This preventive archaeology represents 85% of archaeological activity in France today. To give you an example, in Saint-Denis, here on the right, all the parts in color are the areas which are considered as having high archaeological potential. So if there is an application for a building permit for a project in one of these areas, an application is made to the state, which decides whether operations are necessary. So this is an urban planning document. There are two phases to preventive archaeology. First of all, a diagnosis. We do a dig covering 10% of the zone. We make a report to the state, and depending on that report, the state will decide whether to do a dig covering the whole of the land which is going to be developed. Very often, therefore, the operations stop after this. There's an initial diagnosis, the state decides there's no point in going further, and they stop. Obviously, this is of limited use for mediation activities. It doesn't take very long. It's just a month of work. It depends on the time schedule of the development work. We have to take that into account, which can place pressure on us. And also, it's just a diagnosis. We may find nothing. We can still do some mediation activities to focus attention on this work. We can put up a sign indicating that the dig exists or is being done, to show that that our local districts can have historical archaeological importance, and that's important in deprived areas like ours. We can also organize exhibitions in public spaces around the dig. And when the land allows it, or the discovery, we can have open days which are organized. Preventive archaeology is also interesting for us in that this is right next to people's homes. We can really touch people close to their homes, which can also be linked in with other activities, local tours, which can be organized for people, or with this sort of jigsaw puzzle, which we have showing the different layers in the development of the city. So now I'm going to give you an example of a scheduled archaeological dig. So we had a research program between 2009 and 2017, right in the center of Saint-Denis. Here you have the Basilica Church, the town hall, the market square, and this block of buildings here, which is open land in the middle. This dig was between 2009 and 2017. There were 7 campaigns of digs with about 4 months of activity each year. For this to work from the beginning, the project was organized with a mediator and with myself. From the beginning, we worked together with other colleagues, because obviously these are scientific projects, as we see, but the other components which are essential here for the project are the training, as we will see, and also mediation activities. So, for the scientific objectives for this dig were that we thought that this might be the last opportunity right in the center of Saint-Denis to find a trace of the defensive system, the walls of the town in the 9th century. At that time, there were Viking invasions and the town was seeking to protect itself. So at the end of the 1980s, near the worksite, we had discovered a part of the fortifications, which you can see here, which was very interesting for us because these ditches were then filled in so the town could be extended. And a medieval district was built here for craftsmen. What's interesting here when we have ditches like this which are filled in, is that you have a lot of daily objects which are abandoned to fill them in, and which can be a huge source of information for archaeologists. And also, as the land is damp, sometimes there are organic materials like wood or leather which are preserved by the soil. So on this plot, there was a chance perhaps of discovering a part of these Carolingian period walls, and also understanding the formation and the development of this district of the town. So in addition to these scientific objectives, we also had training objectives to really return to the traditions of archaeology in the past in France. So we decided to set up an internship system for archaeology students from the University of Paris to give them internships, also people from the École des Chartes. We had about 350 volunteers or interns who helped us and who took part in the scientific work on the site. So the schedule for the operation from the beginning was designed on the basis of this. We would dig 4 months a year on average each year between July and the end of October. July and August being the period when students don't have their lessons and when they can do internships on a dig like this one. So archaeology obviously is a profession you have to learn through experience. The other training component here, more for the local people, was an opportunity. We decided in 2010 we had the opportunity to set up a small school activity for 12 men between the ages of 17 and 50, men who were in a difficult social and professional situation, who did not have jobs, who were taken on by an association to do an eco-construction site for access to the site. And so it was a chance for them to get familiarized themselves with the world of work again and to learn some basic skills and to learn a profession. So we used these people to develop the site so that there could be tourist visits. In terms of partnership here, we worked with the Île-de-France Paris region, which financed a part of this from its vocational training budget, and also the intermunicipal authority financed part of this for economic development. Though we also received some European funds for the work. And you see here the difference. They built the barriers and the platforms where people could watch the work from above. So some redevelopment work was done in 2015. We extended the range of the dig. So we had archaeology students working with us, but we were also opening up from the beginning to local people or other people who might have an interest in archaeology for non-professional reasons. And very quickly we came to we had to organize something for these people who weren't studying archaeology. It took us a year to find a solution and to come up with casual work contracts, which we signed with some of these people. And we, at the same time as the students, we also worked with other people who weren't necessarily fit to do all the work on the archaeological dig. So we found a solution of the last campaigns of work to do 1 week dedicated to hosting local people, 5 or 6 people at a time, under the supervision of an archaeology mediator, and with some time for different activities, half a day working on the dig with the other archaeologists, and then also time in our premises discovering other dimensions of archaeology. Obviously, a scheduled dig like this was a big opportunity for us to open up regularly to the public. The idea was to present the research that was underway. This sort of dig is not something people understand necessarily immediately on a visit. Obviously, you can't see everything on site. There's also all the work exploiting the data. So Peter, people obviously have a lot of questions. And so to explain this, what seemed essential to us and the big interest of the project for us with in our discussions with our visitors was it was the presence of the archaeologists, which was important. People wanted to watch the archaeologists working, wanted to see how they do their work, watch them doing the dig. And so really people really wanted to see the archaeologists at work. In terms of mobilization, we opened up in July and August, that's the summer. So there were local people or tourists who could come. And the mediation activities were open every afternoon. There was also a visitor guide, which we created, answering some of the initial questions, which couldn't really explain everything that was being done, but could make people interested in coming to see us and asking more questions and discussing with us about the work that we were doing and talking with the mediators. So we opened 4 afternoons a week and 1 or 2 Sunday afternoons each month. And with the mediator and the archaeologist teams, the archaeologists really played the game. Even the volunteers working on the dig would come back in on a Sunday to work and make themselves available for the public. And that was very important for us. So the impact of these openings is that the work really got people into contact with the history of the city over a long period, a history that many people were not aware of. And it was also an opportunity for tourists to place the Basilica of Saint Denis in its broader environment from medieval times. Obviously also, encourage people to come back and see us. We tried to fit the dig into local event when it was the European Heritage Days, for example, and we made this a regular gathering. So there were people who would come to see us every year when there were the Heritage Days. And also there is an event in Paris which is called La Nuit Blanche with lots of overnight events. And we also use this to try to attract other groups of people to get them to discover the dig. So we had 27,000 visitors who came to visit the dig. Mostly individual visitors. Of course, we wanted to work with young children as well. So we joined forces with our municipal colleagues, our teams from the municipality who are there for children, to try to do activities for children in the summer, simulating archaeological digs each summer, for example. We also worked with schools in September and October each year, and our schools program in total, ranging from the small primary schools onwards through to high school students. So we used the dig to address subjects from the school program, school curriculum. In Saint-Denis, 75% of our schools from municipality visited the site one or more times in the course of the campaigns. 27 schools out of 35 who came. So also what's always interesting in archaeology is crafts activities. I talked about the fact that we have a multicultural population, lots of people who want a French origin, and so who don't necessarily feel that local connection. So we had lots of visitors, people who were going to the local health center or to other places, or tourists also. And for them, we managed to create a link with people who would never usually have come to visit an archaeological site, and who were fascinated by some of the discoveries that we made, and notably those that had a link with their own culture. For example, there were tanning leather activities where people discovered techniques that they also see in their own countries of origin, and this could be a subject for discussion and for developing connections with these people. And we did a number of experimental activities in pottery and using plaster with different participants.
Alors, in fine, bien entendu.
So ultimately, for us, what's good with archaeology is you can actually interpret, you can understand the town. Gets people to think about their environment. There are clues from our past all over the town, even in the names of streets. The roads here on the square next to the dig, there is this round form, which is following, in fact, the trace of the former city wall 1,000 years ago. There are also buildings that people don't even notice anymore, like this drying building from the industrial age. So through archaeology and all these different clues, we can get people to take a fresh look at their own town. And that's the idea, really. Archaeology is a tool also for the present, and a way of understanding our local territory. Why are certain things there? Why is there water? Why is there this? Why is there that? We can understand this through time with the idea that the local people have their place in this. More generally speaking, on the scale of the town, that we also wanted to revitalize the town center and to make good use of public space. Those are two things which are also important here. And indirectly, in a place like Saint-Denis, which has a rather negative image as a suburb with problems of insecurity and poverty, and with its working class past and its political image, this was a chance to give a different image of this town. And the town, I think, capitalized on this in the Euro 2016 football championships, where there were a lot of people who visited the archaeological dig. There you are. So this is a project which mobilized the whole of our team. We had colleagues a lot of colleagues who worked on the operations, and we received a lot of support and subsidies from the state also for the scheduled dig, and also linked in with some European projects on archaeology to promote these activities. Thank you, Christelle, very much for that very rich presentation. Very clear, very well organized. So thank you for giving us that presentation, making that effort. I saw also some of the slides had English translations. Thank you to you. So we see here all the importance of knowledge of archaeology. We often associate archaeology and heritage with the past, but it is interesting that you showed there through these examples, through these practical examples, that today it can contribute to the way we interpret our own towns and the way we see them. And also this interest in getting local people involved in the project seems a very good idea. On the question of getting local people involved in the inventory, we'll be coming back to that in 10 minutes with Claire Tartamella, but I suggest now that we hand over to the participants, French and foreign participants, who may have questions that they would like to ask you. Just a question about the surface area covered by your work. I don't remember exactly. I'll just check that. I really, it doesn't have to be very detailed. The dig was, I don't have the exact figures, but it was small. It was just the central part of one block. Because in Krakow, in the center of town, on the market square, we have about 0.4 hectares. And we don't allow we don't allow more than 1,500 people a day, and that's a dig that goes back to the 9th century on a pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. So it would be interesting to know the surface. And also what you said about the crafts professions, that some people of Saint-Denis discovered crafts, rediscovered crafts from their own background and from the past. So perhaps we can have them involved in the work. I didn't talk about this because it goes on to much more, but there's a lot of work done on promoting the contribution of local people. So we did some experimental archaeology work. So on the basis of the items we found, we used the crafts skills of our population. For example, in the pottery from Roman Gaul times, there was pottery, which we could also make working with people from the town today, working on ceramics, using the skills of people we have today from different parts of the world. So when we do mediation activities, often it's an opportunity to have an exchange with people and an intercultural contribution, which can also establish links between the different people in the territory. It's an example we often mention at Cités et Cités, the work also having local people working on the site and also people using their own skills, which people might have thought were lost, but which do still exist. I see that Georges Wedraugo has his microphone open. Did you want to say something? Yes. First of all, thank you, Christelle. I was lucky enough to visit a site in 2019, and it's a lot of good work was done. This has inspired us here in Burkina Faso, and we have started working with children on questions which are not linked with archaeological digs, because we have very specialized digs and we don't necessarily have the specialists, so the digs are difficult to organize. So what we have attempted to do, based on what we have seen elsewhere, is first to work on the question of pottery with about 30 young people, with peasants who have trained the children over 4 days, and on next Sunday we'll have 30 children and young people who will be working on building a traditional house which we are restoring, so that people can see the reality of what heritage is and experience it directly, to encourage them to be more familiar with their heritage and its construction. So next Sunday we will be doing that, and I was very happy, Christelle, to see this after our experience in Saint-Denis. I really think it's an excellent example, and I hope we will come back. Thank you very much.
Je transmets des questions qui nous
I'm
viennent
passing on the questions we get. I'll just translating the question. So do you have examples of initiatives from the local population on this sort of archaeological project? And who is it who generally makes the decision to where to conduct the dig? The digs, it's the state, it's the government. They own the archaeological items underground. So it's the state. For the preventive archaeology programs, it depends when people apply for a building permit, and for the scheduled archaeological work, it's for research work, but it's still the state that gives its authorization. The government that gives its authorization is very closely supervised in France. And you have to be recognized scientifically by the state to be allowed to do it. So are there sometimes initiatives that come from the grassroots, from the population in archaeology? There are associations and clubs which exist, which sometimes organize scheduled digs. We don't have that in Saint-Denis, but in other places you do have initiatives in the form of non-profit organizations, but they still have to show the state that they do have the competence to do the dig. We have Tony Saadeh, who is a tourist guide, also a specialist in archaeologist in Lebanon, who's asking, can we have access to the studies from the digs there in Saint-Denis? Yeah, there are publications which exist and which are continuing. As a general rule, for us, all the reports on the digs from our preventive archaeology digs, we have to prepare a report, and I'll have to check where you can get that, but you do have access to those documents from the Ministry for Culture, which keeps all the report. They have a library with that information. I'll have to see what you can consult remotely. And we in Saint-Denis, we have But there is a website for Saint-Denis also. And I have another question from Aigas Kuskis, who works in the city of Riga in Latvia. So what's your opinion about one of the modern approaches to archaeology, better not to dig, but to investigate with scanners, etc.? With and that sort of equipment remotely, so that we can leave the heritage intact for future generations, rather than having to destroy the archaeological remains. For me, it's not contradictory. For preventive archaeology are things that are going to be destroyed. We're not there to stop the city being built. So the basic principle is we don't touch the remains unless there really is a threat, which is what happens in preventive maintenance. The city, though, has to develop. For the scheduled digs, it's a bit different because we choose to endanger those remains. But for me, it's not incompatible. We can do both, but generally speaking, the principle is that we dig underground as little as possible. And if there are less invasive, less intrusive, destructive means, we're quite happy to do that to get the data that we can. Are there any other questions from among the participants? I don't see anyone putting up their hand. I'm just looking. Serge, so do you work? I'll put two questions together. Do you work with students? And a second question or remark from Ghassan. In Lebanon, there are associations of potholers who work on digs in troglodytic cliff sites. Obviously, they need a state authorization, and you have already mentioned that you did work with students. For preventive archaeology, it's increasingly complicated because we have to go very quickly and to do it very, very precisely. So if they are master students with experience, we may be able to include them in the team. Otherwise, we do have internships, but it's more working on the collections of the archaeological items. So there is always, though, this aim to train people. We are there to train people for Thank you, Christelle, for your presentation, for answering all the questions. And if there are other questions that come in, we will pass them on to you. So I now suggest that we move on to our second speaker, Claire Tartamella, heritage mediator in Pontivy in Brittany. It's an intermunicipal authority which was recently accredited as a region of art and history, which promotes the heritage there and is awarded a label awarded by the Ministry for Culture. And as part of the application for that accreditation, for that label, there is a participatory inventory of the heritage which was organized. And we wanted to share that experience with you. So Claire, I'll hand over to you, reminding you of some very basic technical points. You have just arrived. There is currently a simultaneous translation from French into English, which is being done live. So therefore, don't go too quickly if you can. And also, if you give any abbreviations, technical abbreviations, which might be very French, explain what they are, which may, as they may not be easy to understand for our participants. So, I'm Claire Tartamella. I'm in charge of heritage at the tourist office of Pontivy. And I am in charge of mediation activities and also projects such as our application. to be acknowledged as a region of art and history. And we were awarded that accreditation almost exactly 1 year ago. So I'm going to try to share the PowerPoint, which I have prepared for my presentation, so that you can see our participatory inventory, grassroots citizens inventory, which can also present you the participants
in médiation et quand il
in
s'agit
the project. So I work at the tourist office, and we work with the local authority of Pontivy. You have the different logos there of the organizations which are involved. So it's a territory which is in Brittany, in the west of France, right in the middle of Brittany, about midway between the north and south coasts of Brittany. When people think of Brittany, they generally think about the sea, and we don't have the sea. And it's quite a large area with a population of 61,500 people in that area. And this project, to be accredited as a region of art and history, was conducted by our local authority covering that area around the town of Pontivy, which is our main town, Pontivy, with a population of 15,000 people. That may seem small to you, but it seems big to us. It's the biggest town in our territory, and the idea of this project was to bring together all the different parts of the local authority and the regions around it in the neighboring counties, covering 36 municipalities. So the project was initially conducted by the Pontivy local authority as part of its application for the Region of Art and History label. It was an experiment that we were organizing, and we started working in the 25 municipalities you have here on the screen. And the idea was that this seemed that we wanted our inventory to involve everybody, not just the participants in the project. We wanted really to take the local people with us on this adventure. That was the idea, and that's the subject of my presentation here today, just to give you some images of what we are. Here, a quick presentation of our local territory, closely linked with the family of the Rowans, the second most powerful family in Brittany before the French Revolution. They built castles like the one in Pontivy, and there was a whole social system developed around them with manor houses, chapels, and their symbol is the diamond you see there on the cross at the top. It's also, we are also linked with the history of Napoleon. Pontivy is one of the two towns in France where the urbanism and architecture bears the traces of Napoleon. And at a time of European wars of the 19th century, there was a canal which was built here between Nantes and Brest, and which passes through the town. So presenting our territory more broadly, we have lots of natural assets as well, which can drive the development of the area with our waterways, forests, two of the largest forests in Brittany. And this natural world is shaped by human hands in the form of agriculture, and also some considerable industrial sites, forges for iron, furnaces, and also hydropower. And of course, a particularly strong Celtic, Breton culture, which is another reason to get people involved. It's a territory where the people are very attached to the identity of the region. Personally, I arrived in 2012, and I was particularly struck by how dynamic this local culture is, the fact that people do want to promote this region, which often is a little bit neglected, but of which they are very proud. And that's what we worked with. And so this inventory was managed in such a way as to get local people involved. In France, inventories were introduced in 1964 by André Malraux, the Minister for Culture, and inventories were often carried out just for knowledge purposes without necessarily wanting to really make use of the information that was collected locally. I discovered this when I went to meet mayors and local councillors. None of them knew that there had been inventory campaigns in their territory in the 60s and 70s. And so there were people who used to come, do inventories, take photographs, draw up their inventory, and they would drop off a file at the town hall, and that was it. It was forgotten, left in a corner or on a shelf and not used. However, what's interesting to bear in mind is that in this local territory, the local politicians have always been very sensitive towards this question. In the archives, I found the red document you see here on the screen, which is an inventory which was carried out quite independently, not by the central state in the 1980s, by a local politician I'll be mentioning again later, who really was interested in this and who was important in our own work. So back even in the 1980s, there were local councillors who knew that we needed to have this local knowledge base. And then there was the application to be a region of art and history. And for that, we needed to conduct an inventory to back to define the focus of the project, and also to draft the application file, which is quite large and requires a lot of information. So we did need to have the material to put into the application file. So we had to be efficient, 36 municipalities that we needed to reflect in the file. One project manager cannot do this alone, and so we wanted the people to participate. So when I arrived, the method which had been chosen was to designate one person in each municipality who was going to fill out the table you have here locally on the screen. Obviously, it's quite complicated. You have to sort of look very closely to see exactly what is written there. So a very complex document to fill out for these people in each municipality, with one person or two maximum in each municipality who accepted to fill out this Excel spreadsheet with lots of different tabs along the bottom: military heritage, archaeology, religious heritage, industrial heritage, public architecture, private architecture. So we needed to fill all of this out, and also to provide other additional information on the protection of the different heritage buildings, and also take photographs. And on that basis, I realized that very few of these people in the different municipalities had provided feedback on this work, and very clearly the method was not right. First of all, we were lacking information on the nature of the heritage. So our contact people then weren't really providing exhaustive inventory. They would just mention certain places, chapels, calvaries, perhaps a manor house, but all the private built heritage was very much missing, even though this can be interesting and is important for our project. We also lacked information on the nature of the information we wanted to collect. It was very variable from one person to another. Either some people would send us just a list of heritage features, and some of the volunteers would put together real files, studies of certain sites, which could be very long and very detailed, without necessarily indicating what the sources of information were that they had used to produce all that knowledge. And we also had a real difficulty with the photo library, how to link the photographs in with the written documents, how to make sure that we were putting the right photos with the right buildings. And sometimes the contact people were taking photographs, using photographs which were quite old. So we didn't necessarily have a snapshot of the heritage as it was today. Another difficulty was the geolocation of the sites, which was often imprecise or missing altogether. And finally, for some of the volunteers, filling out an Excel spreadsheet was a bit complicated. It was really too much to expect of them. So at that stage, we saw that there were interesting things, that there was interesting information in the spreadsheets. And we saw what the local volunteers had seen or identified as their heritage and that they wanted to promote. But the objective of the inventory was meant to be exhaustive and to try to reveal things people might not necessarily have thought of. So that's where we were in 2012. And at the same time, the Brittany region was also working on the subject of its inventory in its territory. So in 2004, when the state transferred the responsibility for the inventory to the regions, the Brittany region decided it shouldn't just be a transfer of powers from the state to the regional authorities. And the Brittany region directly set up tools by which some of its work could be delegated to local players. So the idea of the Brittany region was really to get back to the very essence of what the inventory was supposed to be. I'm showing you this image here because the phrase there you have in speech marks, the perfect weapon against depredations of all kind is the interest that users and people who live in small towns have in their buildings, no matter how modest those buildings might be. So it really is local people taking ownership of their local buildings, even if they are modest. And it was the head of the inventory department of the Brittany region who often quotes this sentence. That really was the objective. And therefore, in 2013, they launched the first call for projects called Participate in the Heritage and Cultural Inventory of Brittany. That was in 2013. We may put in a bid for that call for project in 2014 in the second session of the call for projects. And here you see Bernard Delay, who is the regional councillor who came into my office one day and said, okay, Claire, the region is going to start a participatory inventory. I've been thinking about this since the 1980s. I know the region doesn't have the personnel to carry out the inventory throughout its territory on its own. So I would like to involve you in this project. So that's what we did. We were chosen in this call for projects in 2014. You see the media launch there and the first steering committee. And from there onwards, the expectations of the region and our region corresponded perfectly. We also realized that we had a somewhat particular profile among the different projects which had been chosen. The other choices were local authorities that wanted to introduce their local urbanism plan and who needed to do a quick inventory and were therefore applying to do that on their territory. There were also associations that were specialized in crosses or calvaries who would apply to do an inventory of these sort of sites. What was special with us was that we were offering something even more participatory. We were going to delegate to the local people the work on the inventory of our heritage. As I said, delegating inventory, in fact, it's only delegating a part of it. Claire, I'm just going to step in very, very briefly to say that I'm watching the time. You have 5 minutes left. I know it's always awkward to get the timing right on a video conference because we can't see, but you have just 5 minutes left. Just to make sure that you can go over a tiny bit, but it would be just to make sure that we do have time for questions afterwards. Okay, no problem, Jonathan. So that's what the region sent to us, a method. A method in 3 phases. First of all, listing the heritage features, then going out into the field, taking photographs, geolocating, describing it, naming it, dating it, and putting all of that into the regional database. After that, in the second phase, studying the heritage, there you see the national database, which is called Gertrude. It's an acronym, and I'm not sure I even know exactly what the letters represent, but it's called Gertrude anyway. And to promote, to familiarize people with this inventory and this heritage. So where we delegated some of the work to our local citizens was the fact of listing the sites. For the studies, we do that ourselves as technicians in heritage. What we wanted the volunteers to do was the identifying, detecting the different heritage features. So here there are the databases that you can go and take a look at if you want on internet to see the results of the inventory if you're interested. Here, Carten, which where you have the list of all the different heritage items. Very superficial for the level of information. Then the studies, etc. you have on the portal patrimoine.bzh for Behez, meaning Brittany. And then the photo library, which is public, where you can download pictures of Brittany if you want. So all of that in high definition and free of charge. So the inventory was carried out in a very methodological manner with the technical and administrative specifications, clauses. A scientific committee with the Regional Cultural Affairs Directorate and different cultural stakeholders. The team here from the Tourism and Heritage Centre in charge of the study, and I would like to introduce all of them because, as I said, this was a mission which wasn't just one person, it really is a whole team. And our volunteers from very different backgrounds, sometimes local councillors, sometimes local people with an interest in local history. They are not necessarily systematically specialists in this sort of subject, but people who do feel curious and who are capable of going out into the field and methodically noting down what they see. What we expect from them really is that ability to give a snapshot of their local heritage. And then the challenge is that we worked through the network existing for the application as a region to be accredited as an application as a region of art and history with 80 volunteers, and we gave them all what we call our volunteer kit, which legitimizes their work in the field, with a badge, a letter from the department, a list of text to help them explain what they're doing, then the official documents which they can use in the field to avoid people perhaps giving them a frosty welcome if people don't know who they are. One of the big keys to the success here really was the support we provided to the volunteers. The volunteers were people we have to be really at their disposal at any time of day. If they have a technical problem on the IT, or if they have questions about things that they have listed about which they're not sure. I would say one of the keys to this success, and that's why you have to be several people working on this, is to be capable of answering the phone, answering the emails quickly, welcoming these people in the office at any time of day. The volunteers really give a lot of their time for this participatory inventory. I'll just skip through the next parts. That's the database that they have to fill out online. And we have people from very different backgrounds who are very used to using this sort of IT tool, but also older people who struggle with the IT systems. So we really have to tailor this individually to each volunteer, and that is very important. So 4 years later, we have 3,500 information sheets from the lists of heritage assets. And I think that by the end of 2021, we will have done half of the work. What we should bear in mind is this is a long-term project. We haven't really set a deadline for the end of it. We rotate, renew the team of volunteers as we go along to avoid having people overworked. And that enables us to extend our work, but we can't be dependent on urban projects, for example. We really want knowledge to be the main focus of this. And here you see this cloud of points, our 3,500 data points. It will be doubled or tripled by the time we've finished, which means we need to extend that. And here you also have some of our outreach projects we did with schools. In one of the municipalities, we did 6 sessions with the school kids to teach them how to become tourist guides for their local heritage, with the idea being to teach them how to present an asset from their heritage to their family. And also on an event day we organized, where we had all the parents and grandparents who came to discover their heritage and to see their children presenting that heritage from the inventory. We also work with bigger children here in year 11, so children of 15, 16, working on information sheets on Pontivy, also in Carrefour, you see these kids in class who had always thought there was no heritage locally, and here they realized that there was a genuine 19th century interesting heritage in their town, and also local people who also take part in the mediation activities which we organize here with the owner of a hydraulic mill, for example, and Mr. de Lujour, you see there with his hat, receiving people to visit his castle. So that's the sort of thing that fits in with our inventory. We establish alliances with people who we can then work with to work on the Reach Novaten History project, and people who do this either initially out of obligation or just to go out for a walk or things like that, who really get involved and who feel very proud of what they're doing and of their local heritage, and that's very pleasant to see. And I think that's one of the keys to the success of our project. So thank you for your attention. And I'll be delighted to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much, Claire, for that presentation, that very interesting presentation that shows that the inventory must also be shared with the population and more broadly in many partner countries. And that's true, it's not just in France, also in other countries, there are many initiatives, good initiatives, people who are prepared to work, and you showed the importance of getting everybody working together effectively. I think it is a wonderful network that has been created there and which enables you to work in the field in a context, as we all know, where there are pressures, financial pressures. And in that sort of context, it can be handy to have these volunteers. To pass on a first question which came through the chat from George Wedraugo. How do you recruit your volunteers? I see that you have a very effective method to management with this tool. Thank you. So we go through the local town halls who put out messages to people they knew were interested by the subject. Then there was a lot of press coverage, media activity that we did, local television in Brittany. And then every year in the municipal newsletters, I put a message in just to say that anybody who might be interested in taking part can contact me. So it's a lot of communication work. Personally, I do everything that I can as soon as I think that I see the possibility of a local person joining us or a possibility of a project with a school. I go for it. That will be happening in 2021. We'll be working with a school in a village where there hasn't been an inventory yet, and they're going to do an inventory working with us, which can provide information for other projects they have with data about their heritage. And I'm sure that will produce lots of information sheets for us. So and if any of the participants would like to ask questions, please feel free. A question from Sabina Maslic from Travnik in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Thank you for that very good presentation, which was very informative. Thank you. Is it possible to have the method get the method for the inventory you mentioned and the examples of the description sheets, the ones that you used? Yes, of course, with pleasure. I can send the inventory sheet template or model and also the tutorial for browsing through the public databases and that way you can see that. I have a question about the partnership. If I remember, you have a partner, you work with the Petite Cité de Bretagne, so that's people you've been working with for decades, but I see they weren't mentioned in your presentation. And if I remember, they organize each year for artists to come from different countries who come for 2 to 3 weeks and who create artistic works. So that's the Petite Cité du Caractère. So in Pontivy, there are no towns which are members of the small towns of character, but we do have towns which are members of other networks. And so far for the inventory, we haven't worked yet with such networks, but the partner we work with very efficiently for the inventory is the municipalities of rural heritage of Brittany, who work locally and conduct a detailed inventory for that accreditation, and they have to renew their label every 6 years. And that we do have a certain amount of work in common with them.
Alors ça, c'est une vraie question. Jocelyn n'a pas forcément souhaité s'associer dans un premier temps à la démarche. Je pense que d'ici à une dizaine d'années, il en sera autrement. Mais ça fait partie effectivement des.
But there are other people who work with us. There's also Jocelyn, which is where the Rouen family live at present. They are not part of our label as a region of art and history, but they may want to join us later. So these things can change over time, and we can do things with different people if they want. Are there any other questions? Can you hear me? Still regarding your volunteers. When you contact the volunteers, what do you offer in return to get them to join the project? Honestly, I know we're asking them for a lot, and I think we could probably give them a lot more at present, where we want to get them as closely involved as possible in promoting their work. So we do try to highlight their work through the local networks. But if when we're working on the inventory, we're going to be organizing events. There'll be days organized each year to present the work. There's one of the municipalities which has just finished its inventory, which will be giving some money to the volunteers. They realized that their volunteers had spent more than 200 hours in the municipality, so they have given them an actual amount of money for their work. But we organize this very much on a volunteer basis, and in Brittany, people do often accept quite happily to do things as volunteers, but in return, we probably do need to do more than we're doing at present. But for the moment, they just enjoy the glory of having taken part in the project. And a question from the town of L'Aréole, just outside Bordeaux, for Raymond Vellier, who is a municipal councillor there. What guarantees do you have as to the accuracy of the research done by the volunteers? That's a very good question, and we are very careful. And that's also why we're always very happy to do this with the inventory department of the Brittany region. We do have constant scientific validation of the information by the staff. And in 2016, we discussed this a lot when the inventory department of Brittany presented the project nationally. One of the questions everybody had concerned the scientific quality. So regarding when we do make corrections and validate the information that is listed, and our expertise as technicians enables us either to validate or to adjust or correct the proposals which are made by the volunteers. So there's that first level of validation. After that, once we move on to the studies phase, I'm in charge of the studies, and when I'm preparing a study document on a monument, before it goes into the Brittany database, the project officers from the Brittany inventory check, reread my work to make sure that it is appropriate. So there is always that scientific validation by the official department. Another essential point which I'll mention here, especially as in Pontivy, there is a very close link between heritage and tourism. So if these volunteers who do the heritage can then become ambassadors for their local territory, there have been initiatives, similar initiatives, for example, at the tourist office in Bergerac in the Dordogne in France, where they established a network of ambassadors, which we presented in our training course a few years ago. And the idea was that they should be genuine ambassadors of the local heritage. Are there any other questions from any of the participants? I'll see one last question. That's for José. Thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. I don't know whether you can answer my question, but you talked a lot about volunteers and volunteering. I know in Brittany that is a bit of a tradition, and in France more generally. In different countries of Central Europe for historic regions, there are associations which are not so strong, and in terms of finding volunteers, it's not so easy. But what advice could you perhaps give us on how to try to light the flame of wanting to be volunteers on themes like heritage? This could perhaps be a driver, a lever. So it's sort of a comment and a question at the same time, because here in Central Eastern Europe, we often have this issue, and it is difficult, whether in heritage or in other sectors, to motivate people to work as volunteers. I think there are several things that can be considered. First of all, going through local councillors, politicians who are familiar with the local realities. And also, you also have to promote the inventory work that you're doing and explain why you're doing it. For example, we do lots of mediation, lots of guided visits, conferences, presentations, projects with schools. But I think in the end, if there is something concrete that comes out of the inventory project, that can give people greater motivation to take part in it. We have in the town of Rouen, we have a volunteer, for example, who was working very hard, but they were really struggling. But when they were given a concrete project and they knew what the inventory would be used for, they became much more involved, much more closely involved. So I think it really is, you need to have that prospect of the inventory actually being used for something practical. And one final and very simple question from Casablanca: have you done an inventory of your intangible and cultural heritage? We have planned to do that over the 5 years after the inventory of the buildings. We have partners for that who would like us to start. There is a Breton association that wants us to work on that. We already have 2 municipalities which have started working on that. So there is a methodology which is there for working on a cultural or intangible heritage. But if you are interested, go and look at the website of Bretagne Culture Diversité, Culture and Diversity of Brittany. Thank you for that presentation and your different answers. And there's lots of nice comments for you in the chat, just to say thank you for your presentation. Thanks to you, we've seen a participatory inventory and people taking ownership of their heritage, local people taking ownership of their heritage. So on questions of inventory and knowledge, we've seen the architectural heritage, built heritage, archaeological heritage, but there is another type of heritage which we haven't gone into much for the moment, which is that of landscape and landscapes. And to explain this, I would like to hand over now to Régine Chauvet, who's joining us, the director of the CAUE, the Council of Architecture, Urbanism and the Environment of the Pyrénées-Atlantiques, the Atlantic Pyrenees at the west end of the Pyrenees in southwest France. And she is going to present how knowledge can be developed and promoted on landscapes, notably through a French tool, which is called the Atlas of Landscapes. So, Mrs. Chauvet, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you very much. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen just to make sure that it does actually work. And while that's loading, just quick technical information. There is simultaneous translation during your presentation. So if you wouldn't mind just being a bit careful and not speaking too quickly and avoiding and explaining any abbreviations that you use just for our non-French speaking visitors. Okay, I think. Mode plein écran, so full screen. Is that better? That's perfect. So over to you now for 20 minutes of presentation, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers, because if I understood correctly, you have to leave at 4 p.m. precisely. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much, first of all, for this invitation to be here.
D'où je parle, donc le Conseil d'architecture, d'urbanisme.
The Council of Architecture, Urbanism and the Environment is a public organization which works to promote the quality of our architecture, urban and landscape spaces. And to do so, we provide information to private individuals, local authorities, and we're also a training body, and we work on awareness raising. And we've been doing this for a little over 40 years now at department level. For us, it's the Pyrénées-Atlantiques, and there are other similar organizations in the 92 other departments in France. So to begin, I'm going to look, first of all, what is the object we're talking about here? What is landscape? What is it that we're talking about here? And come to an agreement on that. After that, more particularly the tools that we use for knowledge of the landscape, the atlas, and its many facets. And then I'll show you the atlas of the landscapes of the Pyrénées-Atlantiques and how we put that together. And then another tool, which is complementary to this, which is the Photographic Observatory of Landscapes. So what is landscape? What are we talking about? Landscape is a polysemous notion which encompasses several realities. The word appeared for the first time in the French dictionary in 1949, referring to a painting representing fields or something like that. So since Renaissance times, the social representation of the landscape has changed with industrialization and the development of cities. And through until the 1990s, the landscape was mainly perceived as countryside. Then in the representation, the social representation of landscape, after the idea was extended to take account, to include nature, the environment, biodiversity more generally. And in France, this is quite characteristic. There's a sort of nostalgia for a sort of idyllic countryside inspired by images of the 19th century. So that's our collective awareness, our collective representation of landscape with the little villages with their churches in the middle and farmyards and chickens and things like that, and cornfields. So the definition of the term landscape that we find here has been stabilized in the European Convention for Landscape, which defines the landscape as a part of the territory such as perceived. So it's a territory which is in a certain place, which has a beginning and an end. These can be territories which may be outstanding and which may also be damaged or deteriorated, and may also be banal or very everyday landscapes. The landscape can also be urban, peri-urban, or coastal or mountainous. So this part of the territory as perceived by the population, so it's a value system. The landscape is defined by the person who is looking at it and their cultural references, their sensitivity, their level of expertise. So the landscape architect or the farmer both shape the landscape, but in different ways. So it's a territory, it's an object, the way it is looked at, and it's also a subject. And this subject is the result of the action of natural and or human factors and their interrelation. So there are landscape processes at play, changing. The landscape is not fixed, is not set in stone. And how can we take account of its evolution today? So the atlas of landscape we're going to talk about can be used for this, and we also have an observatory of landscape to measure changes in the landscape. So the tools of the landscape, there are several of them, of several kinds. First of all, there are the protection tools, heritage protection tools. In France, there are regulations to have inventories and to protect of monuments, built monuments or natural heritage, to protect them on account of their outstanding quality. There was a law in 1906 to conserve natural monuments and sites, another law in 1930. These laws at the time were very elitist. They were there to protect things which were exceptional or outstanding. And in both those laws, they talked about sites, but we don't, it really was something very different. So it's since 1993 that there has been a big change in the recognition of the landscape, and all the tools we're going to talk about are derived from that law, basic law of 1993. And from then on, landscape took its place in the urban documents, planning questions, building permits, etc., etc., etc. There are also tools. There are tools of protection, but also tools for knowledge of the landscape. Observatories and different promotion tools. There are landscape plans and charters which exist, and also park and garden management plans. Obviously, the different tools may conflict a little bit, but the Atlas of Landscapes, what is that? It's a tool for knowledge of the landscape at departmental level, which is there to identify, characterize, and qualify all our landscapes. Sorry, I got lost in my presentation. So it's to familiarize ourselves with our department and its changes. So it's organized by the departmental authority with encouragement from the state, which provides financing. France does not have atlases everywhere because it's not an obligation. So the atlas is worked on periodically to take account of changes in the landscape. And it takes account of different processes that modify the landscape, the role of the socio-economic stakeholders in shaping the landscape, the farmers, industrialists, people like that, or industry. I'm thinking of mining landscapes, for example. And they take account also of the particular values attributed to the landscape by the socio-economic players and populations in question. So making an atlas of the landscape consists in identifying, defining and naming characterizing, describing the landscape features and qualifying them, so taking the social representations associated with the landscapes in the territory in question. It also consists in reporting on the singular character of each landscape, the features which characterize it. For example, they can be the slag heaps in mining areas, and then also to share knowledge to define the main features and challenges of the landscape. So these atlases are revised periodically to report on the changes that are made. So an atlas of landscapes, what for? First of all, it serves to guide public action, the action of the authorities. It's a decision-making support tool for planning. It can also increasingly be a basis for projects. We can imagine planning documents, strategic planning documents, or regulatory planning documents based on the landscape, taking account of the landscape. This is increasingly the case. And it can also be a basis for development decision making and for things like that. It can also be a way of raising the awareness of local players. There can be a genuinely pedagogical feature. So it can also be used to capitalize on knowledge, which can then be reused in other contexts. It's a resource which is accessible to professionals, landscape designers, private developers, urbanists, and also project leaders. And it can be made easily accessible. It's data which can be integrated directly into projects. And a landscape tool like this must also foster participation by the public. So the landscape is very much a consensual subject, a subject of consensus. It's a part of our identity. We recognize ourselves in our daily environment. Landscape is part of our culture, and the interest of the citizen has an interest in their landscape, but they also need to understand their action, what the things that they produce through their activity when they do building activities, when they farm, the effects this has on the landscape in their daily life. So all our daily activities have an impact on the landscape, and citizens need to be aware of this. So it works both ways. So the Atlas of Landscape is of interest to everybody. So it's managed by the local authority and by the central government. And the idea is to involve all the stakeholders throughout the process, which lasts about 3 years. With teams, with people from different backgrounds, not just landscape architects. There may also be sociologists and other people, other professions which come and take part in the works working on these atlases, and you generally have a management committee to coordinate the whole process. So the Atlas of Landscapes. The principle was established by the law of 1993. In 1994, there was a first methodological guide, which was published, establishing the method for this, for the first landscape plans. And the ones I will show you that we did in our department, the Pyrénées-Atlantiques, was produced on that basis. After 20 years, we put together a team which conducted a review, and the ministry conducted a review of these documents, which showed that the atlases were being prepared in very different ways in different places and perhaps weren't necessarily precise enough. And this led to great disparity between the different reports, the different atlases that were produced. So in 2013, a second guide was produced, which is one you can see on the screen now, to clarify the method, to manage it more closely, to ensure that the landscape atlases that are produced do better highlight the key changes and challenges and show the continuity between the different atlases. Obviously, landscape does not follow administrative borders. And so we need to have continuity between different areas and to have compatibility between the atlases of the landscape for neighboring regions. And it's important to have a common vocabulary also. So really a lot of work was put in 2013 in the second generation of atlases, of departmental atlases. Is quite different from the first one and allow work on different levels. So we find three key actions: identification, description, and qualification of each landscape. And the key concepts are the landscape structure, landscape unity, and landscape features. I'm going to illustrate what I've been saying by showing images from our first atlas for the Pyrénées-Atlantique department, a department in the far southwest along the border with Spain, with the Pyrenees along the border, and on the west we have the Atlantic Ocean. It's a department which is very varied in terms of its landscapes, mountains, coastal areas, and then plains to the north. And this first version of the atlas was a document, or is in fact a document because it still exists, in 9 volumes. It weighs 12 kilos in A3 format. It's impossible to just go off to a meeting with that under your arm. So it wasn't very practical. However, of great quality, no matter how impractical. And here you see an overview showing the 7 different types of landscapes, which are named here. In the west, we have the Basque country, and to the east, Béarn, with different types of landscape entities. What we notice in this overview is that it's very detailed, that it's very aesthetic, attractive, very detailed, as we'll see later. We don't really see the links with the neighboring areas, which was enhanced more in the second version. But it is still a source of information for us, but we need to go further. So at present, this atlas is being updated and has been since 2019. Cyril Marna, a landscape specialist, is dealing with that. And the objective today is to have a digital atlas on a dedicated website. People will be able to go and see it directly on internet. So the update aims to include the changes that have appeared in the landscape, to take account of the urban fringes that weren't taken into account in the first version, and also the notion of biodiversity and adaptation to climate change, which are essential today. So the method of the atlas from 2003 is a very sensitive one, combining also the cultural dimension. It was prepared by designers, the design and landscape agency Morel and Deleg. I don't know how visible this is on your computer screens. What I wanted to show here is the different scales. The overview of the whole region at the top with the 7 different parts of the department. Within each of them, you then have on the middle map a more sub view. Here you have the total view. Here you have a sub area, that's this one here, called the Sul area in the Basque country. And in each of them, you then have 1 to 5 entities. And in those entities, It's then subdivided into smaller landscape units, which you have here within the Soule area, with more mountainous parts and lower parts. So that's the method to identify which was defined by Morel and Delegue, with an extreme level of detail which perhaps isn't necessarily the approach used today. And to give you a broader view, earlier we were in the Soule. This is an area here. This is the upper Béarn area, the Pyrenean mountains here, with a number of valleys which run from south to north. The Barretus Valley, the Aspe Valley, the Osso Valley here, and here the Ouzon Valley. So we have these valleys here. Then we have a sub area. Here is the valley of Le Valentin. That's here. There in the atlas, you have a description of the valley with a ski resort, for example, and also isolated specific features and description of land occupancy, housing, economics, networks, and infrastructures, which are all described. And then below, you have this ensemble here, which is a landscape unit and which will be presented in cartographic in map form. So here it's the map representing the valley. Here you have the border with Spain to the south. And here on this map, we see the landscape units with the geomorphology, the hydrographic networks, and anthropological aspects, the use of the land, the types of settlement. Landscape, in fact, is shaped by all these phenomena, both geological, meteorological, and also the action of man. And then we have another data sheet here with a description of the different features of this part of the territory, which is characterized with its different assets and the different potential. So it's defined on the basis of a very detailed analysis conducted in the field. So here it's a visual unit. So it's the view, the unity of vision and a homogeneous landscape. So here, this is the landscape, the atmosphere specific to this area of the landscape. Mrs. Chauvet, excuse me, just to interrupt you. I don't know if you've noticed the time, but we've just gone past 10 to 4. If we could allow some, because I see there are some questions already coming in the chat. Okay, I'll speed up. So that's a landscape unit of the Valentin Valley. The landscape specialists went even further, so they went down to an even more detailed level, which isn't usual. So they have a sub-unit. Here, this is the Col d'Aubisque, the Aubisque Col mountain pass, to show all the complexity of the lay of the land here, meriting a special presentation. So the targets of the atlas are civil society, the public, associations, development bodies in different local authorities, also schools and educational communities, residents, tourists. So all these different people are the targets, are the beneficiaries, in fact, of this atlas that is produced. And it's also an opportunity to structure a network of actors involved in the landscape. It also helps guide our reflection and decision making, and also for promoting our territory. And just a very quick focus, and then I will have finished, on the photographic observatory of the landscape, also in the 1980s. So this is a national system of photographic observatories of the landscape, which are based on a national methodology. There are a number of them around French national territory, and there can be bodies like ours which have their own. So with identical views, with an identical frame and depth in a given territory, which will then be rephotographed again and again over time. And the idea is to detect the changes, the developments, the evolution in the landscape, is to enhance our knowledge and also to track development. And it's very pedagogical in that it's very expressive in that we have these photographs taken at different periods and different times. And really, it's often very illustrative and can be useful to understand a certain number of challenges to local politicians and to the population. The method is that the views are taken on the basis of the landscape structure. We have to clearly define the itineraries, the views to be photographed, and then this is done on a recurring basis as certain landscapes evolve at different speeds. If we, for example, this is the observatory, which I took. This is one I took from the ministry. So you see here, I don't have the dates, but you see the development between the period when there were ditches here in a rural area. Then we're beginning to have serials replacing that, and then the roads. And the ditches have been filled in. And the third stage, well, it's all disappeared. It's been developed. There's a shopping center, a business park, and pavement, and the fields have disappeared. And there you have it. I've finished. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Perfect. Thank you, Mrs. Chauvet. Thank you for your presentation. And I'll quickly pass on some of the answers, the many questions that we've received. I'll try to group them together to go more quickly. So 2 questions. Is it possible to have a sample of the atlas of the landscapes or an internet link to go and look at it? And second question, how do you convince the population, the local population, and the government, or the local authorities, I should say, local government, to document and to preserve their natural landscape? For us, in the Pyrenees-Atlantic, the atlas that exists, as I said, is on paper. It has been digitized. I think it's probably accessible, but it's not very practical. There have been atlases, though, however, that have been put into the new form, in digital form. There's the one for the Lot et Garonne, which came out, which I think is very complete and which is accessible easily online. So a lot of departments are currently working on that at the moment. The Dordogne is currently underway, but I don't know if it's finished. I don't know if it's online yet. But I think if you go on the websites of the different departments, you should find them. Ours, once it is revised, will all be visible online. Regarding the population, it's true that the first generation of atlases was a little bit for specialists, buy-in for specialists and experts, and was rather for a limited circle of people. We perhaps didn't make that much effort on presenting it because it was more for professional use. But the second generation, there really is a determination to involve the population. And so there are actions for the atlas. So for example, we organize photo competitions. Last spring, for example, we did a photography competition about the landscape of my lockdown. So to get people to photograph their landscape, and people sent the landscape, some magnificent photographs, because people were in lockdown at home. So that can be one method to get people involved, or to create walking routes with local politicians or local councils to develop, to promote their landscape. We're in a mountain region. People do come here hiking. We have the pilgrimage routes to Compostela in Spain. So this is something that can be a way of getting people involved and combining pleasure and knowledge. And we can have other partners, other bodies which might accept to work with us, working more on the scientific side, like the ecological bodies and other local bodies we work with who have mediators for different aspects of this. Or working with geologists also who can come and explain. There are other aspects also. Our focus is landscape, but we can work with other specialists. So there are things which are organized where we do manage to mobilize people, but landscape is a real issue, a real subject. For us in the CAUE bodies, we were created by a law of 1977 on architecture, and it was a reaction against the damage to the landscape. The idea was to help people to understand and to promote the quality of their landscape and of their architecture and their environment, to fight against urban sprawl and suburbs spreading out and eating up countryside, these spaces which perhaps were losing their cultural roots and their link with their environment and their culture. And so this is something that we focus on in our action, is the cultural approach. And that is something that people understand, people do feel. Local identity is something that people understand. When we work on new territories, and there are regions where earlier we saw Brittany, where it was easy to mobilize volunteers. For us here in our region, the Southwest, it's not so easy. But when you talk about local identity, about their heritage, people do understand these are subjects which bring people together. And nobody wants their environment to be damaged, to be deteriorated. It's part of their identity, at least here in the Basque Country and Béarn. So it's not that difficult. It's not an obstacle to mobilize the population. And I saw the end of the previous presentation, but I am convinced that it could be interesting to have photographic contributions from different people, in addition to our atlas, through competitions of photographs taken by hikers or walkers. And today, with everybody who has their mobile phones, they take absolutely magnificent photographs. So it is quite easy, and it is something that everybody can do. We can work with schools, and so it is a subject for everybody, I think. Okay, thank you very much. So there are two other questions. What are the different labels or accreditations that exist for the landscape in France? And what is the heritage value of the landscape? We're talking about heritage. So what link can be established between heritage and landscape? That's a question for you. So the heritage value of landscape and the accreditations or labels. I mentioned earlier the protections that existed. There are protection systems that exist for the landscape. There are the sites as well, but it's not really a label. It's not an accreditation as such. So protection and management systems, I mentioned a little bit at the beginning. I'm trying to think. There is the major site label. Yes, the major sites can't seat label. We don't have any in our department, so that's perhaps why I didn't think of that. And then there's also a UNESCO listing, which can be for a recognition of landscapes as well. The UNESCO listings, it can be urban landscapes also. But the major sites label, yes, there are a lot of them in the Occitania region next door, not so many in our region. So that's the region next door, not in our region. And then the heritage value of the landscape. Heritage is part of the landscape. The landscape. When we work in grassroots participatory action, people confuse nature and landscape. They think that nature, I mean, nature doesn't really exist. They think of natural nature and spoiled nature, which doesn't really exist anymore in France. That's, we see our landscape has been shaped by humans. We have urban landscapes, rural landscapes, and heritage is an aspect of that landscape. So we can consider that the landscape is a part of the cultural identity and therefore part of our heritage, because that is part of the values that make France attractive. The landscapes. In marketing, we sell an environment, a landscape.
Très bien. Alors, je transmets les dernières questions avant de passer.
Okay, and the final questions before we hand over to our last speaker. Do you work only on natural landscapes or also on anthropological landscapes, like for traditional architecture of villages? And question, are landscapes ranked or classified in terms of how sensitive they are, or how do we decide to do different studies or impact studies when as infrastructure is going to be built? Sorry, I've already forgotten the first question. So the first question was whether you just study the natural heritage or whether you also take account of the natural architecture of villages. We do work a lot on heritage. We're not necessarily experts in protected heritage, but we are present when it comes to the small sort of heritage that isn't protected, the less important heritage. We're partners, we work on that aspect of things, the minor heritage features, which can be taken into account in local planning documents, which are managed by the local authorities under the decentralization process. So I won't talk about protection here because the idea isn't necessarily to protect them or to rank or to classify that heritage, but today when we do building in this century, we're building in a landscape that exists, in an urban or natural environment that exists as it is, and we can't develop and build without taking into account the history of the place and the things that already exist there. And therefore, this heritage, we work on this every day. We can do contemporary architecture, design contemporary architecture that draws inspiration from the past and the things that exist and that fit in, and also to take account of current challenges like climate change. So we work a huge amount on heritage, but that wasn't the subject of my presentation, which was why I didn't talk about it today. And I have to hurry up because I absolutely have to leave for a nearby town. The second question was about the impact studies. That was the third question. So it was the question about are landscapes ranked in terms of their sensitivity, or how do you decide whether an impact study is necessary or not on a given landscape? When we're familiar with them, we describe them, we qualify them. Once they're qualified, we give them a certain level of interest. There are landscapes which are interesting for different reasons. There can be reasons. So we do have everyday landscapes and landscapes which are deteriorated. There are all sorts of different types of landscapes. But there isn't perhaps a classification like you have for listed historic monuments or for parks and gardens or things like that. There isn't necessarily an official classification, apart from the major sites, which we talked about earlier, which do have their own label. It's also recognition of how, as this is profoundly cultural, how do we recognize ourselves in a landscape? And there's also the fact that a landscape has value through the way we see it. A landscape may not look very interesting to some people, but for somebody who grew up there, where it's their own personal environment, they may see a value in it. So there is the whole social approach there to the landscape. Thank you very much, Mrs. Chauvet. There is another question, but we'll send it to you by email if you could answer. And because I wouldn't like to make you late for your appointment, you have to leave us. And thank you for your presentation. And I propose now that we move on to our last presentation of the day. And I'm going to hand over to Mohamed Ali Mouenji, the manager of the old LAMU, who has accepted to give a presentation as part of our international training to present this exceptional site, UNESCO World Heritage listed site, and also the inventory methods applied there. He will be speaking in English. So for those of you who don't speak English, you can click on the button for French down at the bottom and select the French channel. And Mohamed, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And unfortunately, I might not be able to share my video because I have problem with the bandwidth. So it's going to be very slow if I have it on. But I hope we are going to share a wonderful experience together. As introduced, my name is Mohamed Ali Mouenji, currently curator for the LAMU Museums, and I also double up as the heritage manager for the Old Town of LAMU. In my presentation, I am going to share with you an introduction to my site. Wow, I don't know why my slides are not moving. Let's see. Yeah, okay. I would like to share with you an introduction of my site, possibly also mention something about the attributes and the values. We'll also give a brief on the conservation program for the town, just as a context to the inventory systems that have been adapted through the years. And lastly, I will also discuss very, very briefly the intended condition survey that we intend to undertake. And somewhere in the middle, we'll have to justify that with the challenges and the perceived threats before making my conclusion. Lamu is actually in Kenya on the East African coast. It is located on the northernmost part of the Kenyan coast next to Somalia. It consists of a mainland and a hinterland. And Lamu town is located actually on an island. We have in the archipelago, the Lamu archipelago, a number of islands, about 6 or 7, that all are inhabited. And we are going to focus on Lamu Island, which is possibly the most notable of those islands. These are just some of the inhabited islands within the archipelago. This is one of the villages on Lamu Island. This is on a neighboring island, Pate Island. It's an islet within an island. This village is called Faza, quite a spectacle fishing village and quite a nice place to visit. And then we have Lamu Old Town, which is on Lamu Island. The town was actually enlisted into the World Heritage List in 2001 under criteria 2, 4, and 6. And it dates back actually to the 13th century. Though archaeological evidence suggests that it might have been from an earlier period. The emergence of the town, of course, is attributed to the monsoon trade, or what is commonly referred to as the Indian Ocean trade, which actually was able to bring traders from the Indian and the Arabian peninsulas to the East African coast, and led to the entrenchment of this unique fusion, cultural fusion along the East African coast. The town is characterized by very narrow streets, stone buildings. The buildings are ornately decorated with plaster motifs. We also have very, very intricately carved wooden timber doors. And the general building technology is a demonstration of the fusion of technologies from the rim of the Western Indian Ocean. You have attributes that came from the Arabian Peninsula. We have attributes that were borrowed from the Indian Peninsula, and they were mixed up with local technology to come up with this kind of unique building technology. The town is also famed for its cuisine, archaeology, and a very distinct attire, traditional attire. Like the gentleman on my right there is putting up what is commonly used in traditional Swahili weddings, which is a gown and a turban on top. Most prominently, and this some of you might have heard of it, is the Maulidi festivities. The town has evolved over the years as an important center for the propagation of Islam. And one of the most important activities is the Tarika Maulidi festivals, which has become now an annual event. And it is very, very prominent, attracting visitors from not just within the country, but the entire East African coast, and as far as Europe of recent times. Just to give a context before I move into the discussion, is I would like to introduce the planning context. If you look at the country, Lamu is located somewhere here, the county itself, which has a hinterland and an archipelago that is highlighted probably at the bottom. But if you look at this other map, Kenya grew up along that corridor during the advent of the British occupation. They constructed a railway line along that corridor, and eventually the country started to grow along there. So we have most of our big towns are located along this, what we call the Northern Corridor. Most of this section remained largely undeveloped over the years, and so it fell into economic decline. Towns like Lamu, which are located further north, did not really progress. So at the end of the 1960s, the government thought it would be important to devise some kind of plan to develop that region, to develop the rest of the country. And in the process, they initiated an intergovernmental task force that would look at most of the development within that region. What this task force did for Lamu was to come up with a development module that would focus on the historic settlements within the archipelago, the Swahili's development modules. So one of the recommendations of the Working Party was that studies should be undertaken to survey the existing building stocks, especially in settlements like Lamu, among the other Swahili settlements. The goal of the survey was to identify which buildings required innovations, which contained features of unique importance requiring preservation, and which were suitable for demolition and the development as totally new buildings or conversions. Another recommendation was to assess what building standards would be required to ensure that the existing architectural and social cohesion of the town was not destroyed through unsuitable housing or bad siting of buildings. One of the key studies that was undertaken from that recommendation was a survey in 1975 by a gentleman called Usam Gaidan. The survey was actually initiated by the agency that I work for, which is the National Museums of Kenya. And this gentleman came up with a number of inventory forms, one of which was actually adapted. An example is on my right, this one here. And eventually he was able, from that study, to publish a report to the government. From his study, one of the key issues that came out was that he was able to identify different typologies of buildings and document them in detail. So he came up, or rather he identified 3 main typologies of buildings that characterize the old town of Lamu. One of them illustrated here is a veranda building, which is a later addition of the town. This kind of building is found on the Lamu waterfront, and it is referred to normally as the European influenced veranda buildings. These ones can be attributed to the British period, or when the British occupied Lamu. And then we have the more traditional buildings, which they're called the courtyard buildings, buildings which are designed around a central courtyard with a more Arabian influence. And then thirdly, we had a more traditional kind of building called the Makuti building, which is still very prominent within most Swahili settlements, especially the fishing villages within the Swahili cultural landscape. From that study, he was able to come up with a number of maps in his report. For example, this one, it classifies land uses. So he was able to map out uses of the different parcels or buildings within the urban setup. This is a very important planning tool because it enables the authorities to know which areas to focus, which areas require interventions and things like that. Lastly, at the bottom is a classification of buildings according to traditional typology. Even that he was able to, and he just mapped out what was more significance, because in his study he was able to come up with a grading system or a classification system. Buildings that still retained a high degree of their original character, they were graded as classified as grade 1. Buildings that had lost partially some of the traditional attributes were graded as classified as grade 2, and buildings which had significant transformations were grade 3. In 1986, another survey was initiated just to improve on what had been done. This particular survey was done by a gentleman called Francisco Siravo, and it was really an important survey. The first survey from 1975 actually enabled the authorities to have the first level of protection for the town. It is based on the 1975 that Lamu Old Town was gazetted by the national government as a protected historical area. It would be interesting to note that this 1986 survey, which was an improvement of what had been done previously, was actually a more detailed kind of survey. and it came up with quite a number of recommendations with more detailed maps. It actually delineated now the dotted line here. They were actually, from the survey, they were able to delimitate what now we might call as the historical core, or the most important part of the old town, which was eventually enlisted onto the World Heritage Site. So this particular survey, undertaken in 1986, is actually the one that paved the way, and it was very instrumental in the preparation of the nomination dossier for the old town of Lamu as a World Heritage Site. One of the key outputs of that survey was actually the building guidelines. So from the survey, they were able to design a number of, or rather to make recommendations for interventions for the repair of buildings, or for interventions in particular areas that would not adversely affect the character of the town, especially the streetscapes. So down here we have like guidelines for the volume, how high or how huge buildings could be. And in case a property was vacant and you wanted to do a new intervention, what would have been the guidelines? So it was a very important survey, which saw the town, or rather which was now used for as part of the nomination dossier for Lamu. Later on in 2011, through support from the Flemish government through the World Heritage Center, using tools from the historic urban landscapes, my office was able also to undertake a survey, but this time it focused on public open spaces. Most of the initial surveys, the two surveys had been done, identified a number of public open spaces, but these were identified on conventional terms. These were spaces that you could see, or you could easily identify them as open spaces because nothing was built around them, and it is where people met to do a particular kind of function. But under the historic urban landscapes, we were able to identify a different typology of public spaces. These would be just maybe some spot around the corner where old men come to meet in the evenings, or some space outside the mosque that served as a meeting area during different times of the day. So during this exercise, we were able to map out these areas, conduct a condition assessment of the areas, and make recommendations as to what kind of interventions would improve them in order to improve the quality of life within the urban environment. So through the exercise, we also, for the first time, were able to put on a digital platform data that had been collected in the previous two studies. For example, here we have mapped out all the historic maps within Lamu. Fortunately, Lamu has perhaps one of the largest concentration of mosques anywhere in the world. Within 16 hectares, you have probably 38 neighborhood mosques. So all these were able to be mapped on a GIS-based map. Secondly, we were able to map the traditional neighborhoods because the town is structured within particular neighborhoods, each with distinct clan groups and with their own kind of specific identity. And probably just an illustration of the work that was achieved in terms of mapping the different spaces, the traditional spaces and spaces which have just acquired some significance in the recent past. Currently, the town is faced with a number of perceived and real threats. One of them is that we have not been able to actualize our new management plan. We are faced with a very, very major development, maybe within a radius of 60 kilometers from the site. There's been quite a number of exploration off the coast of Kenya, and we are not able to determine how it will affect all these historic settlements. There's always been this proposed coal plant, which right now has been put on hold, but there's been quite a bit of outcry from the community and other civil organizations on a proposed coal plant to power the Lapset project. And then we have dilapidated social and physical infrastructure within the town itself. We have informal settlements and urban sprawl. We have borders. I think might be more familiar with people in Africa. These are actually motorcycle taxis, which have recently mushroomed in most of urban centers as a mode of transport. And then we have some encroachment on the water catchment areas, and of course, major problem on climate change and rising seas. Just to give you a background, the LAPSA project, around here is Lamu. We have this massive intention to put up railway, highway, crude oil pipeline, and the refinery just to open up the country. As I told you, this is their traditional, or rather the old corridor. And this is where most of the major urban centers in Kenya are located. So most of this part of the country is not really developed. It's still very isolated. And the government thinks that if you open up this corridor, then you open up the rest of the country to developments. And of course, target is Ethiopia in the north and southern Sudan to use this new port here to ferry their goods and of course inspire development along that corridor. Problem by most people concerned is that this is Lamu here, and this is the port area on the mainland and a metropolis behind it. So people are feeling like most people who have concerns feel that the developments here might spill over there. But it needs studies, it needs technical information to be able to actually identify the kind of impacts that will spill over to Lamu Island or the Lamu Archipelago, and by extension, Lamu Old Town. This is the situation right now on Lamu mainland. It's still nothing, it's just virgin land. And this is where the port is being developed. And of course, that's an architectural impression or artistic impression, possibly what it will be in 50 years. So that is enough reason to give people some kind of concern. Secondly, urban transformations. We have developments within the site that have been undertaken very, very slowly, but having an impact. We have dilapidating infrastructure. The existing infrastructure right now has been overstretched and is starting to fall apart. We have real threats by rising sea and climate change. This is the situation that we are now experiencing during the springtide. The water is coming up above the seawall, even though it's been experienced only in the recent past, but it's something to think about. And this is just the same place. This is sometime in the 60s. This same sitting bench is the one that you can see here. And people have been used to sitting here like forever. But now it might be a reason for us to think otherwise. And then lastly, my last photograph there is what I'm calling the border. Lamu is a growing town. It is now more cosmopolitan. It deserves, or rather it requires a lot of services and utilities. So borders have been introduced by unemployed youth to offer transportation to the ever-growing urban areas, to move from one point to the other point. They might not be the most ideal thing, but now we are faced with that challenge. Urban sprawl. Here we see Lamu in the 1990s. It was just the urban tissue was not so much, with very, very distinct open spaces around where children used to go to play. And especially if you take note of that area, which is very clear in the 1990s, in the 2000, between 2000 and 2010, a few structures start to appear and the urban tissue starts to move further outside and some little bit of developments further to the south. 2020, the situation is completely different. The space to the north is completely built up. Urban tissue has grown. It has reached the open spaces. This one is completely gone. And the growth of the town further to the south has also grown quite significantly and that space is now gone. Unprecedented urban developments. Swahili settlements in their nature are very modest, very small, and very, if you look at this picture, this is Shela village on Lamu Island. This photograph was taken sometime in the 1970s. In 2020, a new structure, a new face of Shela village. Sometimes the developments or urban sprawl is not negative. It's not that you have this informal kind of settlements. It could be very good developments, but it could wipe out the traditional settlements, because what we are seeing, this is very good because this is now Lamu's tourist area. But what happened there is that the traditional communities, by virtue of the developments, have been systematically moved out. And the people who are moving in, who are investors and people who are coming to enjoy Lamu's climate and things like that, are quite wealthy. So it's a different lifestyle change, which most of the poor people would rather sell and move elsewhere. So the area actually is devoured of the traditional communities and might eventually lose its identity, because the people who are living here might enjoy the architecture, might enjoy the sun, but they do not practice the traditional practices which gives Shela its identity. So in respect to what we've just mentioned up there, we need sufficient technical information to demonstrate that the real impacts on the UV and how they can be mitigated. And that is why my team is right now looking at what we can do. Quite a number of initiatives have already been conceptualized by the county government of Lamu, who is one of our main partners in the conservation of Lamu Old Town. The county government of Lamu is preparing an integrated urban or structure plan for Lamu Island, seen up here. So they want to bring in a consultant to come up with very, very predetermined interventions, what can be done and what cannot be done, how it should be done, and give some kind of development regulations, so that a village like Shela, which is right about there, cannot be drastically or all of a sudden be gentrified, so that the local population is completely moved out. We are saying development in that direction is very good because it provides jobs, it provides incomes, it provides a clean environment, but it should also be accommodative of the traditional or the local communities. So we are hoping that this will be answered with the structure plan. The other thing that the county government is doing is developing an integrated development plan, and at the same time it's coming up with the Lamu municipality solid waste management. What we are thinking is that these are opportunities for us to determine the kind of information that will go into our next survey. We need to update our inventory of buildings. We need to take a stock of what is important in terms of Lamu's attributes as a cultural heritage site and the values that are carried through those attributes. We are also looking into possibility of using modern tools that are available today. This is an example of a mobile application that will or can enable us to collect data on the field in a much more easy way that will enable us to come up with GIS-based mappings from our analysis of the information that we have collected. Concluding is that based on the challenges that we have just discussed of urban transformation, challenges of mega projects within, not very close, but within the precincts, I can say, of the World Heritage property, we need to collect information to update us, to give us an actual technical picture of the threats that either they are perceived or they're real. And in that process, we are going to do a hybrid of the 1975 survey with the 1986 survey, and using the latest tools, both in terms of collecting the data and analyzing the data to come up with our new inventory system. And I would like to thank you for my very brief presentation. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je laisse le temps peut-être à
Thank
Gary.
you very much. I'll just give Gary a second to switch back over to English. Thank you, Mohamed, for that presentation, which was very rich, an analysis of the interest of conserving heritage, but also the different constraints and threats for the old town of Lamu, the questions of gentrification, of urban sprawl, of uncoordinated development, and also the fight against climate change, which will necessarily have an impact on coastal towns, including Lamu, as you showed us there very clearly. Well done for all those initiatives which you showed. I had one question to ask you, but there is another. I see someone else has asked the same question in the chat. Is there a cultural heritage of earth buildings in the region? So buildings built with earth or with clay.
Yes, one of the typologies of buildings that I mentioned was the mud and wattle building, which is more prominent in some of the fishing villages within the archipelago. Within Lamu town, we have an earth building that is very, very important. It is a building that is was the house of the founder of one of the most important religious establishments in Lamu and the founder of the Maulidi festivities. During his time, he lived a very modest life. He did not have a stone building. He actually had a mud and wattle building, which is today gazetted as a protected site. And it is open for visitation during the annual Maulidi festivals. Unfortunately, there isn't so much knowledge on how to preserve this particular building, especially considering that it is exposed to extreme weather, and it's really deteriorating very fast. The internal structure, which is wooden, has been heavily infested by all kinds of pests, and the mud is falling off. One of the aspects of that building that is being protected is that this gentleman called Habib Swaleh, he actually used to repair the surfaces of the wall himself. So some walls have got what people believe to be his handprints, as he did the annual repair with mud. So these handprints have been recommended for preservation, but they're deteriorating very fast, and I don't think we have the kind of technology nor resources to protect them.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. So I will pass on one other question. I don't think Boubacar Keita is connected yet, but it was just to tell you that in Ségou, which is a town on the Niger River in Mali, Cités et Cités Remarquables have been working in cooperation on maintaining this sort of earth building. So we do have experience on these subjects, on maintaining and restoring this sort of mottle and daub building. So we can provide you with information or put you in contact with the coordinator in the town of Ségou, who is coordinating that work.
Yeah,
and another question. What about the question of insecurity in Kenya with terrorist attacks? Does that not have an impact on tourism more generally?
Oh, yes.
How do you cope with this?
Well, that is an interesting question. We've been at the center of quite a number of attacks, mostly on the mainland. That is where it is pretty insecure. Though we've had a number of attacks, if you just look at that map, this is what we refer as the Boni Forest, the shaded area there and here, and it spills over into Somalia. So this is part of the same forest that spills over into Somalia, and you have militant groups moving within the forest, coming and attacking people on Lamu mainland. Of recent, we've had two major attacks. We had an attack here in Kokoni where a British citizen was attacked. And we had an attack on Manda Island where a French citizen was hijacked, unfortunately. What we are doing right now, there's quite a bit of security operations within the Boni area, the Kenyan Armed Forces, and there's an American base somewhere here at Magogoni, which is assisting the Kenyan forces to keep this area safe. Fortunately for the archipelago, because the Kenyan Navy is very active right now in this area, some kind of calm has returned, and especially Lamu Island, tourism has already been reinstated, and we don't have any incidences in Lamu Island. We've not had any particular incidences on Lamu Island.
Très bien.
Very good. And one last question, a twofold question. Do you have intangible cultural heritage also in the town? And have the movements of the traditional population, the gentrification, has that had an impact on the outstanding and universal value of the site, this gentrification that you were talking about?
No, not quite drastically, because the transformations are happening in villages that are outside the World Heritage Property. Nonetheless, these are still very, very important historical villages. So in terms of the OUV of the World Heritage Property, the impact has not been that significant in terms of gentrification. In terms of ICH, Lamu has quite a bit of it. In 2018, through the support of UNESCO, we undertook an inventory program with local youth. So we engaged a number of local youth, and they were trained on the 2003 methodology for inventory, and they invented quite a number of aspects, ranging from architecture to boat building technology, to seamanship, to local crafts, songs, dance, herbal medicine, and all that. One of the main activities that carries a lot of traditional activities is the Maulidi festivities. Prior to the actual religious celebration scene here, a number of cultural dances are performed from all over the Lamu archipelago. And these dances are quite significant, very unique to the Lamu archipelago. Other elements of ICH that we're trying to protect are boat building, because most of the traditional boats are still constructed using the traditional technology. And those are the ones that are used by most of the fishermen to go fishing. So most of these boats are locally manufactured using local materials and local technology. So we have a dedicated program to save that particular knowledge, boat building knowledge.
Très bien. Merci beaucoup.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mohammed. And today's session is finished. Thank you to everybody for being with us today. Thank you to all our different speakers today for presenting their experience, their experiments, which I found very inspiring. We will have an opportunity to discuss them again. We'll see you again next week for 3 more sessions, which will be on Tuesday the 8th, Wednesday the 9th, and Thursday the 10th. And before I leave, I would also like to thank Solène Coulonnier, a project officer at Cités et Cités Remarquables, and who has helped us a lot to prepare this training meeting and to prepare the content that we have been presenting to you in the course of this week. Thank you to Solène. Thank you very much, who has been preparing the international training. And I will see you all next week and have a very good weekend. So I will see you on Tuesday. If you have any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate. You have my email address. Thank you to Gary also. Thank you for interpreting for 2.5 hours. I know it's not easy. Thank you very much and see you all soon.